Thanks so much for joining us.
For sure, for sure. Happy to be here.
Maybe before we get into the nuts and bolts of Arch, talk a little about who you are, where'd you grow up, how did you even think that tech was something that you wanted to be involved with?
How you met us, why we're
How
the
you,
best
yeah,
things that ever happened to you.
totally. You're welcome.
Why was forced to be on here? No.
I was like, you better fucking come on the pod, Phil.
Exactly. Just to be clear, I had no choice. No.
Yeah.
So originally from Germany, grew up on a small strawberry farm that my dad started, and then spent a couple of years in the family business. My dad started it in Christmas tree stands, and spent then a lot of time in solar, in robotic solar installation, installed utility scale solar, mostly in the Middle East. And in 2018, came to the US for school. And that's also when I met the both of you for the MBA and the Masters of Environmental Science. And from there, really, my climate tech journey continued, I would say, and in a slightly different direction than before, no longer solar, now in HVAC. But similarly, equally exciting. And that's a brief overview.
I mean, let's get back to your family business real quick. So I've always found it interesting. You mentioned Christmas tree stands,
Yep.
and then also solar installation. Like, call me crazy, but I wouldn't have necessarily seen the overlap between those kinds of businesses. Like, how did you get involved? How did your family get involved with both, and kind of what role were you playing as well?
Yeah, I mean, it really is all my dad. So my family has been farmers forever, for a couple of 100 years. My dad started strawberry farms in Bavaria. And at some point, he had to put up the Christmas tree on Christmas. And that was like 1988. And he realized, hey, this is actually kind of crappy to put up a Christmas tree, as simple as it sounds. And it took him actually 1 year, and he reinvented basically the Christmas tree stand. Very simple tool now. It's like, just a foot pedal. And at this point, he actually has around 70% of the market share of Christmas tree stands in the world. I know it's like super, super niche.
Oh,
But he's
wow.
always been like a problem solver. Same with, then he invented like the ground screw, which is an oversized screw that you drill in the ground, replaces concrete faster, cheaper, and more environmentally friendly. And one of the major applications is, quite frankly, solar. And so that's when we started actually our solar journey in 2002, when the German government started with feed-in tariffs. It was a big opportunity. And from there, we basically grew into a major solar installation company, and built, in fact, the single largest solar power plant in the Middle East in 2016 at the time. So yeah, quite exciting. And honestly, it goes all back to my dad. I ran the family business from 2016 to 2018. Mostly with my focus area was all the Middle East.
So I also know to the on the solar installation front, and obviously that kind of ties in a lot of where Arch kind of comes into play as well. You were involved at one point in the largest solar installation in the world, as I recall.
Yeah.
Maybe talk a little bit more about that. It's a pretty wild story in and of itself.
Yeah, so there's two components. So I spent most of my time in Iran and the UAE. And so in Iran, it was basically like a greenfield, very much on the nuclear agreement that was signed by Obama in 2016. European companies were allowed to enter a very new market. So there was a whole new experience for myself, but also for the Iranians, that there are suddenly European companies operating in the country. And then at the same time, in 2016 to 2018, we started developing, or helping to develop, the largest solar project in the Middle East, or in the world, with 1,200 megawatt, called Project Swayhan. Was actually the cheapest energy at the time that has ever been produced, at $3.50 per kilowatt hour, which is basically like a new world, or was a new world record. Right now, there's also bigger power plants in development, but at the time, yeah, it was the biggest one, and quite exciting journey back then.
And then, as I recall, once Trump gets elected, strikes down the nuclear deal, the Iran deal, kind of things changed a little bit for you. So maybe talk about like what that process was like when you kind of realized that maybe things were going to be changing, and then your decision to even apply to the GSP to begin with.
Yeah, honestly, quite the big change, right? In 2016, we made the decision to actually heavily invest in business development in the Middle East. and obviously planned and thought, this deal is going to be in place. I think the rationale behind it made sense to foster economic ties, having more influence. And when 2018 came around and the deal was actually struck down, I definitely felt like to some degree disappointed, to some degree a lot of uncertainty, like what's going to happen with all the time and resources that we invested. And in the end, there was no way around of shutting down all operations in the country. And we could continue in the UAE. But since I've spent so much time developing the Middle East, it was also always a desire of mine to work outside the family business. Quite frankly, I always had a chip on my shoulder of, I was in the family business not because I was qualified, simply because I was the son. And so I always had this desire, like, hey, I kind of have to prove myself in the real world outside the family business. And so when this happened, that the nuclear deal went away, it was just a good time for me to venture out. And for quite frankly, for my parents, they always wanted me in the family business, and the only option to go outside the family business was really education. And so the master and the MBA was kind of my way out, my ticket out. And that's really when I came and then applied. While I remember, actually, I was the flight to Iran was always in the middle of the night, and I was sitting on the airplane. I was the only one with the light on, just typing away my essay. I think it was about fostering economic ties across countries that are in conflict, contributing to more peace. I'm not sure if it worked, but that was at least the mission that I came into.
You also run for Miss America.
I thought about it.
World peace. I love it.
Wait, what did you say? World peace?
World peace.
Yeah, casual.
Yeah. Like Missed Universe or something. Got it.
Yeah,
exactly.
Cool.
Maybe
one more question about family business, because I think it's something that a lot of folks are involved with it at some scale, but it's kind of a topic that's neglected in terms of academia or even out in the discourse in many situations. Like there's a course at Stanford on family businesses, but just from your perspective, what kind of makes a successful family business? Why do some family businesses fail? Like, I've always been fascinated by the dynamics there and why some can go so well and some can go so poorly.
Yeah, very good questions. So I think high level family business think slightly different. They have a very long-term perspective. So a family business doesn't tend to think in 5 or 10 years. They usually think in generations, right? So my dad not even just thought about my brother and I, he even thought about my children. And so you take on all decisions that you take a very long time perspective. So I think that's one big differentiator. At the same time, family business have very, I would say, unique challenges. And a lot come from, that there's always this thinking like, oh, my children have to take over the family business. And in fact, most family businesses actually fail in the transition period. So it's one of the most critical times, because usually like the first generation, the founder really, has a vision for the company, again, beyond their own generation. And then, there's the new folks coming in, a different generation. They have a different hunger for risk, quite frankly. And so then there's always a lot of disagreement. And the same for us, right? We had to work through it over years and years. My brother and I with my dad, eventually it worked out well, I would say. But it was definitely a lot of investment into the relationship, talking through conflict, having conflict, and also getting over this conflict was quite important.
So it was like Succession, is what you're saying.
Just
like that. Just like
on
that.
On kindergarten scale, yeah.
Yeah.
I think Phil's kind of Shiv. If I had to think about him as Succession.
That's a major compliment. No, that's a major compliment. He's the least insufferable, so
could have called you Kendall,
I think it's a compliment.
So, yeah.
The eldest son, the elder son. Love it.
So yeah, Phil. So then you applied to GSB to Stanford. You're getting your master's in kind of the environmental side of things as well. Like, what was your kind of goal coming into the school? Like, how did you think about maximizing your 2 years there?
How did I think about maximizing my time there? It was really exploring opportunities. I came in quite open-minded. I know there's almost like two sets of people. Some have a clear vision, what they want to get out of it, where they want to go afterwards, and they start working towards that. For me, I came in, honestly, I don't know where I'm gonna land. Am I gonna land in the corporate world? Am I gonna land in the entrepreneurial world? In the VC world, I kind of started exploring a lot of different paths. And I remember distinctly, probably second quarter, third quarter, I felt quite lost. I was like, wow, like everyone seems to know exactly where they're going to go. I felt like, wow, I don't really have a clear path where to go just yet. But just kept on exploring, kind of sitting through, uncertainty. And it was really then when in my environmental science degree, obviously coming from climate, that was always a passion of mine. That's also why I did the environmental science degree. Learned more about, different technologies in the field, but also was very strategic about it. I was like, hey, in the world, I was always curious about big challenges, like very, very big problems kind of accelerate me. And I get really excited about those. And obviously climate change, I see probably as the biggest challenge humanity has ever faced, even though it's like not always that apparent. In a sense, like we don't feel it on a day-to-day, right? It's not painful on a daily basis. It's more painful in like a 10-year, 20, 30-year time perspective. But honing in on climate change, I was like, okay, where do most of the carbon emissions actually come from? And obviously transportation is a massive sector. But I was actually a bit surprised to learn that the residential sector is responsible for 18% of the carbon emissions in the US. And I focused in on buildings efficiency, then learned more about where's actually most of the energy used in residential buildings. And it turns out that 51% in 2019, at least, of the energy was used for heating and cooling. And it might honestly be even higher now. I haven't looked up the stats the last year, but with work from home, you probably heat your home even more than before or cool it even more than before. And so I was like, wow, this is fascinating. So there's like this massive sector out there. What are we doing today? How are homes heated today? Obviously, oil and gas. I was like, that seems kind of bad. Like we're thinking about cars switching from fuel to electricity, but why are we not doing the same in the home? Like whenever you talk to someone, it's very clear they're going to have an oil or gas furnace. And that's also when my journey really, or my curiosity peaked, and I was like, hey, what's going on here? What technologies are out there? And then just took a bunch of classes around energy efficiency, and was fortunate enough to just work with a stellar set of professors at Stanford, and really dove deeper into that topic. And that's when also my path became a little bit more clear. I was like, wow, this is really exciting me. I did an internship in consulting, which was fun and cool, but it always felt there's like a little bit of a...
Was it? I don't know.
I have to say that no. I actually generally enjoyed it, but there was always like this little spark on the side. I was like, there's a bigger problem out there. There's a bigger problem than increasing the bottom line for even a big company. But there is like this big problem out there, and so what can we do? And then I just started exploring this path of residential buildings and specifically heating and cooling. And then it felt to some degree like a lot of parallels what I've seen in solar, right? So obviously I was a child when my dad started the family business, but I started to seeing like, a highly fragmented market, similar in solar. In 2002, all the solar installers were in fact just electricians. And so a highly fragmented market, right? In the beginning, in 2002, no one knew actually, is solar reliable? Is it working really well? And similar technologies now in the HVAC space, namely heat pumps, at the time or 3-4 years back, were actually not really well known. Whenever I mention heat pumps, people are like, first of all, it sounds boring. Second of all, I don't know what that is, and why should I care? And so, that's really when my path became clearer and clearer. I was still a chicken, meaning I didn't immediately pursue the path. I actually did join a consulting firm, kind of, doing like the very stable, secure path. And, I was reflecting on that a lot. It was simply because I didn't feel ready yet, in a sense, like, do I have the courage? So I actually needed to build the courage. And how I built this was by talking to more people, by doing more research, talking to every player in the field, right? From general contractors, architects, homeowners, obviously, the contractors themselves, policymakers, really everyone in the market. And over time, I started building this courage, and I was like, I gotta do it. Like this can't be true. Like I can't get stuck. As much as I love consulting, um, as much as I liked it, I needed to go out there. And that's really when my entrepreneurial journey started. And first time founder, definitely didn't have the confidence to just jump right into it, but needed to go through the build up.
That's awesome. I feel like I have a very strong grasp over like the problem space, and I remember having brief conversations with you in the past about this and knowing how passionate you are. Like, catch me up on what Arch actually is, and did you go through an iterative process also in figuring out, obviously this is a problem, but how do I tackle it? How did you navigate kind of the idea maze that Leeor likes to call it, and figure out kind of what you wanted to work on and insert yourself into kind of the existing market?
Yeah, was definitely a maze and definitely a bunch of iterations. So I started on basically like a greenfield. I didn't know where to go. I started with the question, there's this technology out there, heat pumps. They are 3 to 5 times as efficient. They're fully electrical. They seem like a good solution to tackle climate change at a very big scale. And then when you looked at the numbers, how many heat pumps were actually in residential homes, it turns out it's probably like somewhere around 10, maybe 15% of homes in the US, compared to Asia and Europe, where the percentage is significantly higher. And then I just tried to understand what's going on. Why does the US not have more of this technology in homes? So first, trying to understand the reasons why the state of the world is as it is. And that's when I talked to all the folks that I mentioned before. I started to understand, okay, there's very legitimate reasons. There's like the homeowner side and there's the contractor side. On the homeowner side, heat pumps are quite frankly just more expensive. On average, they're twice as expensive as the average oil and gas furnace. At the same time, there's a lot of uncertainty around the savings. So some people or some contractors argue like you can actually save, but no one can actually tell you, right? So what I did was quite a simple test. I just invited 15 installers to my apartment here and asked them for like quotes and asked them for quotes from a gas furnace to a heat pump. And it was actually kind of wild. It was not even twice as expensive. It was sometimes 4 times as expensive. The average gas furnace was like 10 grand. And then some of the heat pumps were actually 40 grand. And then I was like, okay, now you got to tell me how much I'm going to save. Like, I'm not going to spend an extra 30 grand without, knowing, right. Especially as a student, obviously. I mean, not that I actually would have done it, but none of the installers were in fact able to tell me how much I would save from installing a heat pump. I was like, okay, that's the first big problem. No homeowner can actually reasonably make the decision to invest in such an expensive technology if you don't know if you're actually going to save money, because that's what it eventually comes down to. Mm-hmm. And that was actually one of my learnings in solar as well. And that's actually my approach to fighting climate change. Is not about hoping that people change their mind, that they're becoming environmentally conscious. I always thought, it has to be the economics. In fact, I jokingly say, Leeor is from Texas, so I can say it. Like, if someone works in oil and gas in Texas, they still need to choose the heat pump because it makes so much economic sense. Mm-hmm. And that's our goal. That's where we started. But so that's the homeowner side. A lot of uncertainty, high upfront costs. On the flip side, there's the contractors, right? And it's not that contractors don't want to tell the homeowner how much they're going to save. In fact, it would be actually an amazing sales pitch for them if they could tell you, like, hey, you know what, Steph? It's going to be more expensive, but you're going to be fine in 3 or 4 or 5 years. It's actually paid back and you're going to save money. Well, no one can actually tell you that. And why is that? One, they're lacking the tools, quite frankly, and it's not super easy because you have to take into consideration so many things like the building envelope, even the people who live in the home, right? Different heating behaviors. And second, quite frankly, the contractors also spend a lot of time on site. So it turns out they spend 70% of the time driving to customers, which is super valuable because you need to actually also educate the homeowners, especially in the beginning of heat pumps. Mm-hmm. And then go through like home analytics. Basically, they analyze a home, they get a feel for the home, what's the heat load. Then they configure an entire system. Then they do create a proposal and send it to the homeowner. But all in all, it usually takes like 3 to 4 or 5 hours per home. and they have a sales conversion rate. The national average is around 20-25%. So quite, what that means is 80% of the time, the contractors actually spend on homes where they're not going to close the sale. So one, that's very frustrating for salespeople. 80% of the time, they're going somewhere that doesn't turn into a sale. And number two, it's obviously quite resource intense to do that. And so understanding, and there's, by the way, there's more problems out there. There's one, awareness, right? That's another one. There's not enough workforce out there. The trades, I think they are growing now, and they are simply the people who put climate technologies into homes. So they're one of the key pieces, if not the key piece in the industry to actually get to change. But that's when we really started, okay, these are the problems. Now I understand the reasons why is the state of the world like this? And then I started just thinking through a few ideas. I was like, okay, let's think about the homeowner. It's very expensive. They need to understand what the savings are. So I was like, okay, so what can we do here, right? And started actually with a B2C platform, basically, that connected homeowners with contractors. And at the time, I was like, okay, I'm going to have a marketing budget of $5,000. I put it into Google Ads and I got 3 leads. Basically, they clicked like, hey, I want to buy. So I just spent more than $1,500 per lead. I was like, oh, that's from a business point of view, this might actually not work out. And so after going through this learning process, I went into solutioning, and until I came to a place. And actually, that's also when I started talking to Leeor and was brainstorming a few ideas, and eventually landed on a more contractor focused model. So a B2B platform, and that helps the installers to actually solve the pain points of the homeowners, but at the same time solve the pain points of the contractor. And that was one way more viable. It's simply like an easier motion to get to those contractors than to just get the general public. And once I figured out a direction where to go next, to some degree, I also felt like, wow, this has been quite a lonely journey. And so that's one, I felt lonely. Number two, it also landed on a software solution. And I've been in robotics and some software, but not a software founder or software experience. So I was like, okay, for me, it doesn't make sense to start a software company as a first-time founder. So let's go out and find the best possible co-founder out there. There was 2021 when I started to search for a co-founder, and basically went on like this global chase for finding the best possible co-founder. Everyone was open to it. There was only meeting virtually. That's a little bit about the journey, about where we started, all about learning, understanding the status quo, and then almost like envisioning where it should be and how do we remove all these blockers for the homeowners and the contractors.
Question for actually both of you, since I think there's definitely some similarities in this part of the journey. Maybe we can start with Steph, but there's different kind of combinations of team formation. And so, the one thing I think in both of your cases, you're founders, you have like the core concept or idea. It's kind of, I don't want to take away from any other team members, but the initial insight is your insight. And then you're trying to figure out someone to partner up with. What advice do you have to give to founders that, might not have that person necessarily baked in, or that they feel most comfortable with building the product that they're trying to build? And like, how do you even structure that kind of a relationship with them in order to figure out if they're the right person to even go on this journey with together? Maybe start with Steph.
I was like, oh man, I don't know. That's literally why I'm a solo founder. Maybe I need to learn from Phil. And
no, but even like getting your first like technical hires, like I think there's like a different type of relationship there.
There is. I agree with that so much. I mean, Phil, hearing your story, I was like, I've felt lonely before, certainly, and now I'm fortunate to have a team and feel less lonely. But I definitely resonate with that. And yeah, in full transparency, I really did try to find a co-founder for a while. And then I just, after basically 3 major attempts and failures as a result, just decided to go at it solo, because I felt like the urgency to kind of pushing things forward, became like a greater kind of driver of urgency than waiting for the perfect person. But I think even still today, not that I'm actively searching for one, but I could see a world in which I meet someone who I feel like aligns on values and passion for the business and brings a really valuable skill set for that specific time that we are in the business. And I could see that changing. And I've talked to a lot of founders who've added like late co-founders, if you will. And it's funny how that kind of gets glossed over when obviously you become really, really big. But, I would say that you can't wait for the perfect timing, but just be open-minded about, I guess, when you add that person. That's my only quote unquote advice.
What's like the right way, do you think, or even from your experiences, to like structure that test? Like, because I mean, I think even if the outcome is, hey, we're not a good fit together, like that's a good to know. And I think some people just end up rushing into a relationship and then, they have to go through, a tougher breakup down the line. So like what's even the right way to structure the test?
Yeah, for me, it was forcing decisions quickly. Like, I think in my experience, when there's like a big fork in the road or some kind of obstacle, or it's time to quit your job, or it's time to raise, or there's some really big milestone that increases the amount of commitment that someone has to show, or there's some kind of negative event, like there's a hiccup in the business, right? All of that to me is the biggest, actually it's like the biggest blessing, because that's what shows someone's commitment and its reality. So I would say I think a lot of people hold off on trying to get to those milestones in hopes of like feeling like things are together. But I actually vouch for people getting to those with your potential co-founder and testing each other and that cohesion sooner rather than later, rather than kind of like pushing off those kinds of like tough conversations or potential hiccups, if you will. Yeah.
So did you structure it in a way that you had an agreement, hey, we're going to go through this milestone together, and then we're going to evaluate our co-foundership?
Yeah, for me, it was more, I think what my first mistake was, I was, during my first kind of like co-founder search, I was so excited about working with this person that I delayed any tough conversations or, forcing of commitment, whether it's like he needs to quit his job or invest money into the business like I was or whatever. Because I was like, okay, with more time, he's going to see the vision that I do and he's going to be really excited about joining me. And then the end result was like, we worked together for like 9 to 12 months, but at the end of that 9 to 12 months, it ended up falling apart. And so I think for the following ones, it wasn't like, hey, we need to hit a milestone together by month 1, but it was like the natural things in the business that I felt were kind of nagging at me, whether it was like, okay, we really need to raise right now, or hey, like, this is going to require us to like really focus for the next 2 weeks, and like, frankly, deprioritize everything else. Like, those are the moments that you see whether someone's actually going to meet you where you are. So I didn't try to find a force or anything, but I think instead of avoiding those tough things by either taking on more responsibility myself or avoiding those conversations, I just felt like I let it come and use that signal as kind of more powerful, like a more powerful weeding function, if that makes sense at all.
Kind of leading kind of back to Phil, your journey as well. I think there's some similarities that I'm observing there too. I mean, one angle that I thought was that I actually, one of the things I got most excited about at the beginning was when you were talking about how you were thinking through your tests and working with folks, and you ended up coming to the conclusion that even though Sacha, your co-founder, is extremely accomplished in his own right and created the largest wildfire project in Australia, YC-backed founder, like there were folks that you could have argued were more like on paper like impressive. They had higher roles at larger tech companies. So just curious, like from kind of what Steph's getting at, but even some of the similarities and differences, like how did you think about your process and eventually landing on Sacha?
Yeah, so our process was, or I had a very structured process in terms of finding a co-founder. So I was just sourcing through all possible channels, obviously like the personal network, a bunch of those platforms, word of mouth. And then I had, I think, 120 candidates that I talked to at some point, and started narrowing it down. And it was, I would say 50 were good, like on paper, and then 30 were really, really good. And I started a process with them. And part of this process was going through, I think it's called the 50 questions for co-founders. I think it's put up by First Round. And that has been incredibly, incredibly helpful. It took us quite a while to actually go through that. And I didn't go through the entire 50 questions with most people, because over this time commitment, you almost realize, hey, these are people that I can actually spend 10, 15 hours with. I think with Sacha, I probably spent more than 20 or 30 hours on these questions, and very much often came up with our own questions that dove a little bit deeper into these topics. But what I really liked about those questions, they actually allowed you to ask very difficult questions. So one question I wouldn't have thought about, it was obviously like, hey, what's your vision for the company? How do you think about hiring? And then there's one question, do you have a criminal record? I was like, it would have been kind of an awkward conversation to have to just randomly ask that, because it's a part of the questionnaire, you simply ask it and it's in there, so we're going to answer it. And so actually the journey of, high time commitment in the co-founder search almost was self-selecting. Like, who could I actually spend 15, 20 hours with? And so it came down, to 3 people in the end. And as you mentioned, Leeor, like head of data science and like very big tech companies and all these folks. But what really stood out about Sacha was his grit, and actually makes me just so happy to think about it. It's really his story to tell. But at the age of 14, he moved out. He started working in restaurants as a waiter. And at some point, I was like, you know what? I'm not going to do that for the rest of my life. So I'm going to teach myself coding. So he started he taught himself coding, dropped out from high school, never finished it, I think, actually, and started developing like small tools for companies in Belgium. That's where he's from. Without a high school degree, he actually got into the best college of Belgium. Started like a Tinder before Tinder, immediately failed, but had already like a lot of learnings, and he just kept on going, right? And what really stood out to me, he never really had a backup, and yet he took the biggest risks. I would say, like, I have a backup right now. I have a family business. I'm comfortable. That's not very impressive. The people that impress me are the people who don't really have a backup. They don't have something to fall back on, and yet they're taking these crazy risks. And actually, I have a lot of friends like those, because these are the people I'm drawn to. They're like super inspirational for me. And then Sacha continued his entrepreneurial journey, started a big tech company in Australia that is YC backed. And then, at some point, I think it was the historic wildfires of Australia that happened. And he was in Sydney at the time, and he just grew more and more anxious. And he was like, you know what, I have to do something. And so he started developing this early wildfire detection software where he used satellite imaging to detect wildfires early, which is then way easier to fight the fire than when it's way bigger already. And turns out, disaster software, kind of like very long sales cycles, kind of hard to scale. And so he was also looking for what's his role in fighting climate change. He joined OnDeck. I never was part of OnDeck, but one of my friends was a mentor there, and he connected Sacha and me. And so Sacha, that's how I got connected with Sacha. And then he was full of, my co-founder dating. Same for Sacha. He actually had a bunch of options out there that he explored. But I think we very much clicked. And, the key that stood so out to me was Sacha's grit, like just so much adversity, and he would just keep on fighting through it. I was like, this is the type of partner I want in, this 15, 20-year journey.
That's awesome. One follow-up question before we move on. I'm like in awe. Like the fact that you had 120 options to me is also mind-blowing and impressive in itself, let alone obviously all the time investment that you took to ultimately find Sacha, which is amazing. But I'm curious, just purely asking for a friend, I've never experienced this myself, but I guess there are 2 challenges that I've seen myself, but also anecdotally through other people when you're a non-technical person looking for a co-founder. One is that there's definitely like the classic cliche, oh my God, business person looking for a technical person. And it seems like the technical folks always have kind of the most options. And so even just getting in front of people and putting yourself as a candidate always seems hard. It's something that I've been really, I felt like I've had a chip in my shoulder about. And then 2, on the opposite, if you try to fix that by kind of coming to the table with experience, or I think even just like a flushed out idea that you're really passionate about, the other thing that you risk is like isolating the other person, right? Because they weren't with you at the formation of the idea. So I'm kind of curious how you balance those 2 things to ultimately, find so many candidates, but then ultimately find your right person, if you will.
Yeah. So on the technical side of things, I was also, while I was looking for like the person with the most grit, I was also looking for someone who's a really good complement to my skills. It just makes the early days so much easier. And Sacha, as a software expert, obviously had those functional skills. The interesting thing about the field that we are in, it's not just software engineering, it's also a lot of mechanical engineering. And that's my background, right? That's what I did in undergrad.
Mm.
And so I brought a lot of the mechanical perspective to the table. And then Sacha, and combined with Sacha's software knowledge. And on the question around, bringing them along the journey, I think what aligns Sacha and myself really well, it doesn't matter as much what is the specific idea. I think our dimensions, what we were looking at, we were aligned on having massive impact. In fact, what I also loved about Sacha, he came to me and was like, Phil, you have to convince me, idea is great, convince me that you want to tackle a gigaton of carbon emissions in the world. Like, how are you planning on doing that, right? And so it was not as much about the idea, it was always about, are we mission aligned? Do we have the same big mission? And so I think Sacha wasn't as hesitant to buy into the idea as long as it fits his vision as well of the 1 gigaton of carbon emissions. And I think it's all about finding like the right person, right? I can totally see how it can be more difficult to align if you haven't been at the origin of the idea. For us, luckily, through mission alignment, it wasn't a big deal.
Awesome.
So you start working with Sacha, you make the transition from kind of consumer to B2B, but still, thinking of like March of last year, February, when we started talking, like, frankly, like no one, at least like many folks did not give a shit about heat pumps, to put it lightly. And so just curious, like, what was it like, getting folks excited about heat pumps? And then at the same time, several months later, Biden signs the Inflation Reduction Act, which has a massive, credit for heat pumps themselves and make it a lot more economical. So maybe talk a little bit about getting folks excited before that, and then what it was like, after that, and kind of the influx of activity in this broader space.
Yeah, how did I get people excited? I mean, I think I just talked a lot about it, and to a point where like my friends and roommates were like, Phil, you gotta stop doing that. And every time I would be at a dinner, and like they knew I'm gonna start talking about heat pumps, and they would literally just roll their eyes and sometimes even walk out. But I was just so excited, or I'm still so excited about it, so I would just keep talking about it. And I tried to do my research, right? I was not like, oh, I'm just gonna jump into this. I actually tried to understand, why is this gonna fail? Like that was one question I asked, and I found 10 reasons why this market will fail, and then I tried to understand what has to change so it actually doesn't fail. Why I was convinced around the technology is part of my research was I mentioned the big upfront cost. So I was like, okay, this is the status quo, but what happens in 5 years? What happens in 10 years? And so what we see in those industries, or what we see in solar, there's innovation that usually comes first to the commercial space, then trickles down in the residential space. And if you want to go even earlier, you go into like the research phase to universities. So what I did, I talked to folks in the commercial space and was like, oh wow, I'm already seeing innovation there that hasn't reached the residential space yet. So I knew, okay, there's a reduction in cost, or the opposite, an increase in efficiency of the systems in the pipeline. And I was like, okay, that's probably not enough yet. So let me also see what universities are doing. And then I saw like literally Stanford, Dartmouth, and I think one or two other universities that I heard of. They are having like big research projects for heat pumps in the pipeline. And actually a lot of them announced now, a lot of them came actually out of stealth. And the research is now basically in the commercial space, if not already in the residential space. And so it gave me just a very long-term perspective. I wasn't just looking at the status quo. I was looking into very much what's the future. And not that I can predict the future, I was just looking at commercial and research. And I was like, okay, what does that mean for the market that I'm going to enter? And luckily, I'm probably going to take 1 or 2 years of ramp up time anyways. So it's actually a good timing if I see this innovation down the line already. Now, I was fortunate that I was in kind of the end of the spectrum, right? If you're in research, it's a little bit harder, or if you're in commercial, it's a little bit harder to identify what's to come. But from the residential point of view, it was kind of convenient to talk to those folks and see what most likely will hit the residential market. And so I started that was like a data point that I had to develop more conviction around it. And I think I just did so much research at some point that I could answer nearly every single question. I think at this point there were no new questions from from friends, from engineers, from contractors, from VCs. I could basically answer any question, and in a very confident way, and usually backed with research. And I think where people actually got really excited, at least that's what they told me, is when I basically dissected the market and why it will fail. So one thing that is, I think, is still a big challenge is actually the electricity grid. If we would put heat pumps into every single home today, the electricity grid would literally fail. So I was like, okay, not big blocker. That's kind of a bummer. And so I was like, okay, what must happen? And so I was looking at how long does the US usually take to double the size of the electricity grid. And I think it was like 25, 30 years. I was like, okay, if I do the math now, it actually still doesn't pan out. So what is the threshold that the replacement rate or the increase in capacity has to be? And so I was looking at other technologies. And China, in fact, has really good transmission technologies. So I was like, okay, so there's most likely going to be technology spillover at some point, maybe now less. The research I did was 2020, 2021. Now there might be less, but I know it's possible. I know that there's technological innovation possible that will actually increase capacity faster than it has been in the past. Now, this is an assumption I'm making. I can't for sure say that, right? That's like reading a crystal ball. But I had that's a bet I'm taking. But that's a bet I'm willing to take because I actually have a lot of information around it. I know it's possible, and I see it already somewhere else. And so now we just have to transfer it over. So it's just a matter of timing. Will it unblock in the next 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years? But it's going definitely in the right direction. And just really understanding the risks and understanding why the market could fail, and then also making really fair assumptions, I think gave a lot of confidence to folks. And, I always try to be super objective about it because it's eventually like de-risking my jump into the market. I was like, I can do so many other things. I want to be very mindful in which market I go. And let me do all the research and all the thinking about it if it actually makes sense. And so it was to some degree, I think, founding is about taking risks at the same time de-risking where you can with a reasonable amount of effort. And that's what I try to do.
By the way, Steph, as an aside, how are we doing on time on your end? 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll do kind of slightly faster, maybe responses just heads up, Phil, just because of time constraints. But anyway,
sounds good.
We'll edit this part out. So super interesting. You kind of end up kind of landing on this, sales planning and engineering software for heat pump installers. But maybe talk a little bit about, and we have obviously a relationship here as the round is emerging. You're getting folks excited about something that maybe they'd never heard of. You're, talking about, the importance of building this whole thing out. And, there are some kind of, again, regulation changes that are coming in the pipe, but that hadn't emerged kind of when you started this process. So just curious, like how did you think about fundraising? Like, what was like that whole process like when you had to like explain something? It's not like you're selling another design tool that maybe some folks are more familiar with. You're talking about vertical software to the trades, to this thing that maybe people are unfamiliar about. Some would argue it was probably fairly tricky at the time.
Yeah, how I structured it. So first of all, as a first-time founder, never raised money before, had no idea. And I think there was also the step after finding the team, building the conviction, doing my first customer trials. After I realized, okay, there's traction. Now I knew, okay, it's probably time to start actually investing more of my time and more resources into that. And that's when I was like, okay, it's time to fundraise at least a tiny amount.
Wait, what were those proof points, by the way? When you say track, I'm just curious. I feel like a lot of people question that as well. Like, when's the right time? At what point in your customer traction did you feel like this is ready?
We started building just Figma models, and it was really difficult to sell a vision to the trades. It was not like, wow, I can build this amazing tool, and this is what it would look like, and this is the impact. It was kind of hard. They were a little bit skeptical. They're like, okay, you're just another tool. That's not really interesting. But with Figma models, and where they could just click through a little bit and interact with it, and you suddenly saw the wow. They're like, wow, this is actually amazing, and we could really use that. That's when things started changing, and just seeing the excitement from customers. I think there was a really a point where just talking to them didn't give them enough context, I guess. And then giving something or putting something in their hands that they at least could play with, and that they see, oh, this is how it works in an ideal state. And then seeing their excitement, and then sometimes even following up with us. They're like, hey, in fact, one contractor was like, oh, wow, I want you to like, I came back like 2 months later. He was like, hey, don't wait 2 months the next time. I want you to come back a month later and talk to me again, right? I was like, okay. So there's some interest here. And I think this can show up in a variety of proof points, right? It doesn't have to be like, oh, they follow up. That's not like the one all be all. But it can be a number of clicks, a number of searches. It can be that they are coming to you. Like there's so many data points. And I think it's very much a gray zone rather than, oh, now is the time. It was like a judgment call in the moment.
Very cool.
But yeah, and then because I didn't have any experience, and still probably don't have much, but I was just talking to a lot of like our founder friends, and to also VCs. From the people we know, a lot of our classmates were extremely helpful. And honestly, like I was talking to Leeor not for fundraising. Actually, I was just wanted his advice, and I was like, "Hey, man, like, do you have like half an hour?" And if I'm not mistaken, he was also like, "Oh my god!" I'm sure you were like, "Oh, I don't want to talk about heat pumps. This is like the most boring thing."
It was one of those things where I was like, I'm trying to like, I'm still getting better at this. When things are like, when I haven't heard about something yet, I like try to get more excited about it. Like that's kind of like weird, like. And at the time, I mean, eventually there were a lot of heat pump startups after your Arch was started.
Oh, is that true?
But, after the Inflation Reduction Act, there was more activity. I think a lot of them ended up going down the road that Phil had already kind of X'd out was a more difficult route, I think, to his credit. And so once I started hearing about this thing that no one else was talking about, at least at the time, at first I was like, what is this thing? And then I was like, I kind of love the fact that no one else was talking about it and that you cared so freaking much about it. And I was like, this is like a good combination. I think there's something.
Yeah. So what happened with Leeor was really, we had the first conversation. He just gave me feedback. I never done a pitch deck. So he helped me with the structure and all these things. And then one thing I consistently heard from other founders was running a good process, meaning you don't want to talk to like one investor and then 3 weeks later to another one. You actually kind of want to bring them along in the journey, all somewhat simultaneously. And obviously that's one, like you want to create excitement in the market. Investors obviously talk to each other. So it's helpful to bring them along together. And then eventually, ideally, you have, multiple options, and to some degree can also have some negotiation leverage. That's simply what you as an entrepreneur have to do as well. And Leeor had kind of like a head start compared to everyone else because I was approaching him as a friend and like, hey, just give me feedback. And he didn't tell me that he's actually interested. He was. I just realized later that he has been doing like a lot of research in the background. And then when the rounds started forming, he was like, hey, by the way, let me tell you, I talked to a couple of folks.
That's so funny.
Yeah, totally. We were talking to heat pump installers. I got our intern at the time, Avi Mueller, shout out. We were like talking to, heat pump installers and trying to get a sense. And then we're doing like a lot of, you'd mentioned a lot of the regulation that was coming down the pipe and kind of validated that there was something starting to really happen. And so, I mean, I think the thing that we got right about the process, at least, is like, once we kind of were excited about what you were doing, we did the legwork in the background so that by the time something was happening, we could get to conviction.
You were ready for sure. And and then suddenly then then we started basically actually starting the fundraise. Actually, I definitely got a bit, it wasn't like not the best process that I ran because I started doing like coffee chats, but those coffee chats started turning into pitches. So we started earlier than I wanted to. So we started over July 4th, which is probably the single worst week in the year or maybe Christmas is worse. But other than that, it's like the single worst week to actually start. And what actually happened, and Leeor, I think you know the story, but at some point I wake up in the morning, it was a Thursday morning, I have 4 different people reach out, including Leeor, and he's like, hey, this guy from Co2 wants to talk to you too. And I'm like, okay. And then he reaches out a few hours later on LinkedIn, David. And David is like, hey, sorry to bother you with so many inbounds, but really want to chat with you. Are you free tomorrow? And I'm like, hey, I'm actually super packed tomorrow. Let's talk in a week or 2 because I tried to push everything back, right? I didn't want to actually start over July 4th. And he goes, I'm free from 5 a.m. till 12 a.m. I can make any time work. I'm like, God damn it, I'm obviously not busy from 5 a.m. to 12 a.m. so, and I also don't want to be seen as like, oh, I'm not working hard. So of course I can take a meeting at 7 a.m. And so I took the meeting with David that that was, I think you were, Leeor, you were also like kind of our hype man in the background. And I had a really good connection with David, who was at Co2 at the time. And that honestly very much accelerated the process. David is someone similar to Leeor who acts with a lot of conviction once they've built it, and then really pushes the process. And so that's when we started fundraising over July 4th. But honestly, maybe it was also an advantage because I think we were probably like the only stupid company doing that. So, while there was not a lot of mind space, there was more because there were just no other companies. So it kind of worked out. And I think, Leeor, you mentioned the policies that were in the pipeline and that we were aware of, and they were great. And I think they serve as an accelerator. But one key learning from the solar industry was in Germany that you cannot build a business based on incentives. In fact, in Germany, I bet with you, if I look up the stats, 95% of the companies that started solar companies are probably gone. They are no longer there. You need to and that's why, because we didn't have the IRA, I didn't think it's passing, to be honest. Like Joe Manchin was not supposed to sign it, but signed it in a backdoor deal. And so that was like amazing for us. But we basically created the company, created the business model, or thought through the business model without any government incentives. We thought of them down the road as an accelerator, California banning oil and gas, but the business was viable without any incentives. And I think that's super important. And we, as Leeor pointed out, we were in fact the only company in heat pumps, other than maybe Dandelion, you could argue, from Google X, that actually got funding before the IRA. Everyone else came after the IRA.
Fascinating.
Maybe final question about Arch before we get into rapid fire. Would love to hear like what you can share about the status of the business today. What does Arch look like now?
Yeah, so Arch is basically like the brain for heat pump sales, really. So it's all supposed to make the life easier of the contractor and give more transparency to the homeowner. So what does that mean? We're doing like a lot of home analytics, so contractors can analyze homes very comprehensively. Then our system optimizes the entire heat pump design, and then also helps them guide the homeowners as well as the contractors through an efficient sales process. We just started rolling out the product with some medium and some larger companies, so quite exciting. Now more external pressure, right? Because now there's suddenly like all these external deadlines, but probably the most fun time our team has ever had. We're still very small. We're just 6 people. We got lucky in the sense that for why we were able to hire very experienced team members was, there was like this whole dynamic in the tech market. And so really experienced people actually started joining, earlier stage companies. And so just started rolling out, have a small team up and running. And I think hopefully in a new stage of the company soon, but seems to be going in the right direction. At least there's a lot of green flags.
That's awesome. I'm super excited for you. And I feel inspired. I know the last time that we caught up about this at length, it was very much you were ideating and passionate about going to classes and learning. And so to see it form in such an amazing way, and, obviously just to see you guys working together too is really exciting. So I'm personally really
Thank you.
Invigorated by this conversation. Yeah. Let's move into rapid fire. So these are meant to be quick, top of mind, whatever comes to mind first, answer in one sentence or less kind of questions. So the first one we like to ask is the founder that you look up to most.
Yeah, that's easy. That's definitely my dad. I think he always taught myself and all his teammates how to dream and let people dream with him. And that's just, I think, what I hope to carry forward from him.
Love that. The book that most changed your life?
Oh, I think there's two. One is more tactical and one is more like big picture thinking. When breath becomes air.
Love that.
That
book.
really puts everything into perspective. And you're like, wow,
Yes.
I'm stressed, but I really don't have to be. And then Why We Sleep is just, on a day-to-day basis, it definitely changed how I'm approaching sleep, and probably like in a better way.
What job would you want if you couldn't be a founder of Arch?
And maybe I'll do that in my next life or in 30 years. But I'm very fascinated by tidal energy, just as an amazing energy source. And so I don't know what the role is, but like an ocean engineer or coastal engineer on a boat and exploring tidal energy would probably be something I would love to do.
Your favorite account, and this can be anything from a newsletter to a meme account, Twitter account, anything that you follow.
Can it be podcasts?
Yeah, let's do it.
So other than something new, obviously.
Obviously.
I think it's actually a combination. I think they are kind of like on the opposite side of spectrum, and Leeor is going to laugh. But on the one hand, Lex Friedman, and then on the other hand, the All In podcast. And I think those together give like a really funny combination. Very different format, very different people, very different approach, but both of them are probably my favorites.
I'd say you're one of the less cliche founders that I know, but that is definitely one of your more cliche founder traits, which is endearing.
Hey, I'm still a sheep. We're all sheep, so
yeah,
that is true. What was your first entrepreneurial endeavor? It can be anything. I know you mentioned like obviously working on your family business and with your dad, but I'm curious if there's anything. It could be super small or something from your younger days of anything entrepreneurial that you did. First.
Yeah, it just happened to be so. In my high school, I was organizing like every quarter, I think, like parties. And those just turned at some point into like for the school, actually like official school parties. And we charged like just cover for them. And then I made like a revenue sharing agreement with the bars that we were at. And then those just turned into like really profitable party things until the German IRS was basically, hey guys, you can't run a school like a business. You can't just make like profits and just sit on a bunch of cash. And so I think that was like my first somewhat, when I got into trouble for doing business.
I love it. And then the last is, what's a piece of conventional wisdom that you strongly disagree with? Could be general or related to your industry or anything.
Well, so I'm always like very skeptical of taking advice at face value. I think that's one. I think you're usually the person who knows the context the most. So advice is a data point, but not like a plan of action. And I think on a more technical basis, having short pitch decks. My pitch deck was more than 50 or more than 60 pages. And I would never send that out. Yeah. But it was basically my knowledge base. And every time someone in the fundraising process asked a question, I basically was ready and had like everything there. And so I think sending out and having 12 main pages is great. But I had like 50 to 60 and I think it worked really well.
Wow. I love that.
Yeah.
This is awesome. PK, thank you. This is lovely.
Yeah, thank you. This was fun. First podcast for me in my life. So
let's go.
It's great.
Amazing.
Do it. All in next.
Exactly.
And then back to something new to like talk about.
Yeah.